Hello everyone, welcome to another Shadowlands Elemental Shaman video guide slash discussion. I've gotten a lot of requests on talking about the whole situation with 9.05 and how that is going to be affecting the Shaman, all these changes. Also, all of the recent testing that I've been doing for Skybreakers and the videos that I've been posting on that gameplay. A lot of people have been asking, hey, can we do a guide? Can we do something for the Skybreakers build? So here it is. It's relatively early, the patch is not dropped yet, but the information that I've gathered thus far is still very relevant to what we are going to be doing come 9.05. So this is going to be a discussion videos. I have various talking points, and we're going to be talking about pros and cons of each playstyle. This is talking about just strictly the legendary Skybreakers of Fiery Demise. We already know the playstyles of both Echoes of the Great Sundering and Windspeakers in dungeons, so this video is going to be regarding Skybreakers Fiery Demise. 9.05 changes to Shaman, what they mean to Elemental Shaman, and how it's opening up new builds and playstyles for us. The changes in mindsets for both the Storm Elemental compared to the Fire Elemental. When you're running either of those, you need to be doing a lot of different things in comparison to those two. We're going to be describing how the playstyles of each elemental works and kind of running through a little bit of extra information like changes in stat shifts and spell rotations. So starting off, if you guys haven't subscribed already, but you do enjoy the content that I put out on YouTube, definitely hit that subscribe button, ring the bell notification for when I release new content, and for the sake of the algorithm, like the video if you like it, and comment down below. So, changes. What's happening? Come 9.05, we are getting a buff across the board for all Shaman specs to Chain Lightning of 35%, as well as Lightning Shield. Now this is far more impactful than the Lightning Shield buff, and for a couple reasons. We use Stormkeeper as Elemental Shaman, and this is a direct buff to Stormkeeper, as well as this makes us also want to start using Chain Lightning come the patch on 2 targets. Not just 3, but now 2, because on 2 targets Chain Lightning is going to be doing slightly more damage than Lightning Bolt would. For Elemental alone, Earthshock's damage has been increased by 30%. Earthquake's damage has been increased by 70%. Lava Beam's damage has been increased by 35% to match the Chain Lightning buff. And Lava Burst's damage has been reduced by 10%. This is both for Elemental and for Restoration. There's been some enhanced changes as well, but we're just strictly covering Elemental, as it's quite obvious that I pretty much only play Elemental Shaman for my Shaman spec, even though from time to time I do dabble. So let's talk about why they've buffed Earthquake. They recently also nerfed Echoes of the Great Sundering from additional damage on Earthquake when you Earthshock from 175% down to 120. A previous patch or build before, it was just 100%, and they realized that that didn't really make any sense, so they buffed it up just slightly to 120%. So what this is doing is they're essentially taking the damage from our Echoes of the Great Sundering Legendary and putting it in our base kit. Now, this is a good thing. This is a very good thing, because this boosts our base damage quite significantly for AoE, but it also opens up potential additional builds, legendary uses, talent as well to go with those legendary uses, because we're no longer reliant on Echoes of the Great Sundering to do our amazing AoE damage, or to increase our AoE damage, because now it's just baseline increased, both in the form of the Chain Lightning buff and the Earthquake buff. They've also tweaked a little bit of the Covenant abilities, so Vesper Totem got its damage and healing increased by 25% for Kyrian. Fate Transfusion's damage was increased by 25%, and the healing damage conversion increased to 60% was 40%. The heal radius was also increased to 20 yards, was 12 yards. Primordial Wave for Necrolord of Enhancement Shaman. Its lightning bolts now deal increased damage. And Chain Harvest damage and healing is increased by 15% for both Elemental and Restoration. I get a lot of questions. Oh, does this mean we're swapping Covenants? Does this mean like we're going Kyrian because of the Vesper Totem? Does this mean we're going Chain like Venthyr for the Chain Harvest? And with the buffs to our spender spells, that being Earthshock and Earthquake receiving such a massive increase in damage, this also means that Maelstrom Generation has become more and more valuable. Now, there is only currently one Covenant that gives us increased Maelstrom Generation, and that is Necrolords, with the ability to spread additional Flame Shocks, and our Lava Bursts now also being casted on any target that afflicted by Flame Shock, giving us full value of Maelstrom for those extra Lava Bursts being casted. This means that Necrolords slightly becomes more favorable due to that alone situation of the increased Maelstrom Generation and the increase in damage from our spenders. Even though they have slightly nerfed the damage of Lava Burst, this doesn't really affect our single target that much because of the increased in Earthshock damage. For single target, it is a very, very slight increase of shifting the damage from Lava Burst into Earthshock. And it also kind of changes the stat weights a little bit. Crit becomes slightly more valuable, and other things as well. So I hope that answers a few underlying questions. I know I kind of skimmed over a lot of things. There could be some more intricate questions, but if you have those, leave them in the comment section down below, and I'll do my best to get back to you on that. Moving over to our second topic of these changes. What does this mean when they have nerfed Echoes of the Great Sundering? What does this open up in terms of the way that we can play Shaman? Now, recently I have been dabbling in Skybreakers Fiery Demise and the ability to lower the cooldown on our Fire Elemental and our Storm Elemental. Skybreakers Fiery Demise makes our Flame Shocks damage over time critical strikes, reduce the cooldown on Fire Elemental or Storm Elemental. If you are spec'd into it, you see the tooltip updates there, by 1 second, and Flame Shock has a 50% increased critical strike chance by default. This means that Storm Elemental can be used in Mythic Plus because our damage of the base damage of our Earthquakes have been increased. We're no longer reliant on Echoes of the Great Sundering, as I said, so you can use and dabble into different legendaries. You guys may notice that I've been doing this kind of research and gameplay, kind of practicing this whole Skybreakers setup for a couple weeks now, for a few weeks, and you may notice that I've done like several high keys with the build. We're going to discuss the pros and cons of the Skybreakers Fiery Demise, but I also want to do a quick disclaimer. It's not the only option. Just because I'm playing it does not mean that everybody else has to play it. It does not mean that it's the only option if you still want to play Echoes of the Great Sundering. It is still a damage increase to do so. It is still a viable gameplay option. But if you don't like the mechanical gameplay of that legendary, you can use Windspeaker's Lava Resurgence instead for more priority target damage, and you'll still have really good AoE damage because of the buffs to our base damage come the patch. If you prefer a more cooldown-oriented playstyle, spreading Flame Shocks, and using Primordial Wave if you're a Necrolord to send out a massive amounts of Lava Bursts because you can have so many Flame Shocks up during your Fire Elemental window. Skybreakers allows more Fire Elemental windows. If you play it, that is another way of doing it. If you prefer more upfront burst damage and compiling all of your cooldowns into one window, Storm Elemental is very good for that. Reducing you could potentially reduce the cooldown of Storm Elemental to up to 1 minute, depending on how good you are at keeping your Flame Shocks up, using it on cooldown. But I should say this as well. Storm Elemental is only really, really good in a well-organized group. The group composition, the tanks, the communication, all of that stuff. It is really only good if you can play it to its utmost potential, and that is only possible in an organized group. You may have seen some of my videos lately where I've done 22s, Spires, Missive Tyrannus Scythe, 21 Sanguine Depths, 22 Plaguefall, right? 22 Necrotic Wake. All of those dungeons I've been using Storm Elemental, and that is not a relatable circumstance to many of my viewers, and I just need to make that clear. So unless you can get full value out of the Storm Elemental and get it often and understand how to properly play it, I do not recommend playing it, because you can get so much more damage out of Master of the Elements and Fire Elemental by doing a regular buffing your Earthquake kind of play style with Master of the Elements. Now, let's talk about the pros and cons of each playstyle. Each playstyle only consisting of Skybreakers Fiery Demise, because that's what we're talking about in this video. Each playstyle being Fire Elemental or Storm Elemental. The pros of Fire Elemental is obviously more Fire Elemental uptime, because when your Fire Elemental is out, your Flame Shocks increase duration of 100%. You can have more Flame Shocks out because of that, and because you have more Flame Shocks out, you are taking Flame Shocks more rapidly, and you're reducing the cooldown of Fire Elemental far faster than you would have for Storm Element. That also being said, your Flame Shock damage over the duration of the entire key is going to be much higher than usual. As you can see here, in this example where I'm hovering over my damage details meter, my Flame Shock is 14% of my overall. This was a 20 the other side, where this is an example from, and another pro would be that this is more consistent damage. It's less cooldown reliant because you have Master of the Elements to boost your offensive spender spells such as Earthquake and Earthshock. So it's more consistent overall damage. You can get very high sustained damage with this build, but the con to it is that it doesn't work as well with the current tank meta. Tanks right now have to do a lot of kiting, and because the majority of our damage comes from our Earthquakes, and that being a ground targeted ability, a lot of the time tanks are going to be moving out of the Earthquakes, and the mobs are going to be moving out of the Earthquakes, and your Earthquakes are not going to be able to get full value from you putting them on the ground and them obviously lasting 6 seconds. All that jazz. So this build can be used for the majority of the time, and I prefer to use this build in keys where upfront burst damage is not really necessary, or not really in a group that is well organized in Discord. Everybody knows what they're doing and it's a high key. I would prefer to use this build in a much lower key, much lower relatable situation, especially for my viewers. So I've been using this lately on lower keys, and it's actually quite good. Like, it is a very good playstyle. It's far less cooldown reliance. You don't have to worry about managing all of your cooldowns and making sure that they're always up together, which is more favorable, and you can do more consistent sustained damage, especially on single target. Whereas the pros and cons of Storm Elemental. Storm Elemental, in my opinion, fits better in the current tank meta because you're compiling all of your cooldowns and your offensive buffs into one window where you can get the most value out of that one window. That being your Storm Elemental burst window with Eye of the Storm. A lot of the time when I'm using Storm Elemental, Eye of the Storm would be anywhere between 12 to 16% of my overall damage, and that's exciting, especially in dungeons where you're able to pull a lot of mobs in one dense area, such as Mists of Tyrannus Scythe, Halls of Atonement, the other side, just to give you guys a few examples. Even if you take the right path in Spires of Ascension, you could also use Storm Elemental on those big packs as well on that side. So it's good in that situation. The problem is it requires a lot of management, a lot of Flame Shock management. You pretty much have to press Flame Shock on cooldown because of the current duration of Flame Shock being 18 seconds and its own cooldown being 6 seconds. You can have 2 to 3 Flame Shocks up at a single moment, but that just means that your Storm Elemental itself, its cooldown doesn't come up as fast as Fire Elemental, just naturally. So it requires a lot more management. And I also prefer to run Bonesmith Hymir with the Marrowed Gemstone buff. This plays a big part in the whole Storm Elemental build, but it has one drawback, as it's quite important to run a cancelaura macro to actually control this buff, because you obviously want your Marrowed Gemstone buff to be active, the whole crit buff to be active during your Storm Elemental window. And if you're not careful this can proc before or after your Storm Elemental window when you do not want it to. You want this crit buff to be active during your Eye of the Storm, especially in a big AoE combat scenario. And I have to constantly be looking at my Marrowed Gemstone buff. Thankfully, I've used a weak aura to be able to track it, but I constantly use a cancelaura macro to manage these stacks properly. It's a lot of micromanaging of your flame shocks, of your buffs, and that sometimes is not appealing to some people. It's a high skill cap playstyle, and it's not for everybody, and that's why it also requires a very well organized group and a lot of skill to run it. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get a lot out of it. So the con to that is quite big, but if you prefer a harder playstyle where you get really big numbers during your cooldown, that could be for you. But on the other side, it's so good for the current meta because a lot more of your damage is more upfront and less of it is more over a sustained period. During your Storm Elemental window as well, I also recommend using Flame Shock off cooldown. Even if instinctively you want to just spam cast Chain Lightning and Earthquake, the whole idea of this build is to have your Storm Elemental up for pretty much every burst window that you want, or as consistently as possible, as often as possible. You want your Eye of the Storm window to come up as often as possible, and for pretty much every pack that would be more impactful. And that means that you pretty much need to be using Flame Shock on cooldown. I'm getting ahead of myself here, so why don't we go on to the next section, which is the changes in mindset for each elemental. I talked a little bit about Storm Elemental and how it kind of works together and how you want to be approaching it, but let's go back to Fire Elemental. So Fire Elemental requires you to do a lot of flame shocking, but this is an integral part of it. During your Fire Elemental windows, you can have a crap ton of flame shocks out because of the increased duration. During your Fire Elemental, your flame shocks duration is increased by 100%, making the duration 35 seconds, 36 seconds on a normal cast. If you refresh it, this goes up to 46 seconds due to that one mechanic that I can't find the name of right now. So if you're using Flame Shock on cooldown, you can have 8-9 Flame Shocks out. And I've done this before where I've been able to use Primordial Wave. I get resets on Primordial Wave, and I can do back-to-back Flame Shocks and Primordial Wave empowered Lava Bursts, and I'm hitting like 7, 8, 9 targets with Lava Bursts. And this is a big part of your damage during your Fire Elemental window. When you're using Fire Elemental, you actually want to run double potency, right? And you can do this either with Emily, or you can do this with Bonesmith Hymir as well, so that you get the Tumbling Waves. Tumbling Waves is quite favorable. You don't need the extra crit from Marrowed Gemstone. It's not required with Fire Elemental. In fact, if you were to run Marrowed Gemstone, it would really only benefit your Stormkeeper windows, but you would probably get a lot more value out of Tumbling Waves because of the extra Flame Shocks. You're lowering the cooldown of your Fire Elemental even further, and you're just getting more and more Lava Burst damage out every single time. Also, you're running actually Master of the Elements as well, making sure that you're buffing every single Earthquake, or as many Earthquakes as you possibly can, with this buff, and this is going to be especially important come the 70% increased damage buff in 9.05. So, Fire Elemental playstyle, spreading your Flame Shocks during your Fire Elemental window. Primordial Wave usage, really strong here. Echoes are Master of the Elements on your Earthquakes and your Earth Shocks. Now, for Storm Elemental, I talked a little bit about this before, but the majority of your mindset should be around constantly making sure that all of your cooldowns are up during that single moment. What's really good about this is that Stormkeeper and Badge of Ferocity are on a 1-minute cooldown, so those are always going to be up together. And your Storm Elemental, I've gotten Storm Elemental down to anywhere between 1 minute 10 seconds to 1 minute 25 seconds, usually if I'm managing my Flame Shocks well enough, or if there's a priest in the group and they're Night Fae and they gave me Fae Guardians, I can get Storm Elemental down to sub 1 minute cooldown. So compiling and making sure that all of your cooldowns as well as crit buffs from Marrowed Gemstone are all together during your burst windows, that's a huge part of you running the Storm Elemental. It's a different playstyle, it's a different mindset, it's more micromanagement like we said, and it's hard. It's not easy to play. So I don't recommend doing it unless you're willing to put in a lot of practice and time, as well as communication with your group. It's very interesting to kind of show you guys what these playstyles look like. The amount of flame shock targets are really, really important based off of the elemental that you're using. So why don't we go over to the training dummies in Orgrimmar so that I can show you guys essentially what it looks like. All right, now that we're here at the training dummies, I can kind of show you guys a little bit of how the playstyle essentially works, both with Storm Elemental and with Fire Elemental. And since I'm actually running the Skybreakers Fiery Demise trait, I'm going to be able to get the Elemental off cooldown pretty early. So something about the Storm Elemental that not many of you guys will know is that your Primordial Wave doesn't play a huge part in your damage of Storm Elemental, but there is a neat trick during your Primordial Wave buff window that I would recommend using. And that's going to be getting your 4th Flame Shock out before you actually use the Lava Burst to consume your Primordial Wave buff. So let's see what this kind of looks like. You can Flame Shock your first target, Primordial Wave your second, right? Start using Chain Lightning and Earthquakes, and now you want to use Flame Shock off cooldown here. Start using your Chain Lightning, and as your 4th Flame Shock comes off cooldown, now we can actually use it. And you get 4 Flame Shocks, or 4 Lava Bursts out there. You're pretty much using Flame Shock on cooldown here, using Chain Lightning and Earthquakes outside of that. As you can see, my Storm Elemental, it's already past 1 minute cooldown. But if you keep up the Flame Shocks, once we get past the 1 minute cooldown here, you can see how much it's actually ticking down due to the Flame Shock crits. So we're going to be doing another one of those 4 Flame Shock Lava Burst spreads here. Getting all of that Maelstrom back. And we see Storm Elemental is coming up relatively soon to the same time that Chain Lightning or your Stormkeeper, your badge is up, and Marrowed Gemstone. So we can see that the cooldowns can align if you are using Flame Shock off cooldown. And this is a very important part of that. As long as you're using Flame Shock off cooldown with this, obviously the damage would be a lot higher. If the mobs were clumped together, everything would be in the Earthquake. And the patch was actually here. You would see all the different damage numbers as well. But this is just an example. So I hope that kind of makes sense. Now, we can wait for Fire Elemental to come off cooldown, and I can kind of show you guys what that's going to look like as well. So I'll reapply Flame Shocks. I'll do all of this to make sure that Fire Elemental comes off cooldown. But it's quite impactful. Flame Shocking off cooldown to the cooldown, to reduce the cooldown of Storm Elemental enough so that it is up for your burst window, which is your Stormkeeper, your badge, right? Your Marrowed Gemstone. Okay, so everything can line up. You just have to do the work to do it. All right, let's get over to Fire Elemental instead. And we'll also play Emily. So this is actually going to be another part of the video that I want to talk about. The differences between double potency Emily and double potency Hymir. Now Hymir, you get the standard 3% intellect as long as your gear is enchanted. And if your gear is not enchanted, there's a problem. So you get the standard 3% increased intellect. But with Emily, you kind of have to worry a little bit more about the lead by example buff. And this can kind of skew the way that you view your opener and the way that you view your damage. The Emily buff lasts for 7.5 seconds, which if you're not careful and you don't kind of slow down and view the big picture of how your damage is supposed to look like, you could preemptively put out damage before you would have gotten the most benefit out of it. So for some people, I would actually recommend running double potency Hymir, so that they don't have to overthink the lead by example buff or standing in melee or standing clumped together with your group in order to actually use this buff. But instead, just react to the tumbling waves resets. There's no rush on using the lava bursts because of the buff, and it's just more chill. So why don't we use Bonesmith here for the example. And I'll show you guys that maintaining flame shocks on multiple targets is completely possible, and so many targets, by the way, during your fire elemental window. So the opener is pretty similar. I'm not really worrying too much about my primordial wave until I've had multiple flame shocks out. And I have so much time on these remaining flame shocks that I can start to spread it to a 5th target. Even a 6th target, all the way over here. Okay? And look how fast Fire Elemental is coming off cooldown. It's going to be off cooldown before my Stormkeeper. And this is a big part of it right here, is actually spreading flame shocks and getting these monster lava burst waves. But also keeping in mind that when you're generating Maelstrom, right, you want a lava burst before your earthquakes, because you want to empower them with Master of the Elements. Resetting those flame shocks, reacting to procs of Aftershock, looking at your Fire Elemental coming off cooldown, okay, reacting to that as well. You can be so much more liberal with your Fire Elemental cooldown. It doesn't require you to constantly use it with other cooldowns, because it's up so often with this build. Like, if you have enough flame shocks and combat actually lasts long enough, you could use Storm Elemental 3 times before you use your 2nd Stormkeeper. Depending on how many flame shocks, of course. Your 2nd or your 3rd Stormkeeper, excuse me. Not really your 2nd, but your 2nd or your 3rd. So it's quite interesting. The change in playstyle is drastic, but not too drastic, and it's more about it's a slower actual gameplay. It's not very fast, it's just kind of chill. So this is another big moment where I'm just getting multiple procs of lava surges, primordial wave resets, and you can see how impactful the Maelstrom generation is. The extra lava burst damage. Lava burst is still going to be quite substantial, but your flame shock damage itself is going to be very, very powerful. So it's just a matter of maintaining flame shocks, keeping an eye on your Maelstrom, and buffing up your big earthquakes now with Master of the Elements. So, now that I've thoroughly explained not Stormkeeper, but Skybreakers Fiery Demise, I wanted to quickly do a disclaimer again that by no means is this going to be the be-all, end-all legendary build. I just wanted to simply have a discussion video about the potential optional builds that have been now introduced into the Mythic Plus scene because of the damage of Echoes of the Great Sundering being moved into our base kit. This opens up a lot of different opportunities for us, both in builds, playstyles, and legendary usage. So I wanted to release a video for you guys to explain how to properly use these legendaries in Mythic Plus. I'm going to be releasing a 9.05 guide for Mythic Plus that is going to talk about pretty much everything that I talked about in my last video, but for the build itself, for the new patch build 9.05 for Shaman. So I wanted to do a more detailed video explaining Skybreakers, and I'll be referring to this video in the guide for those of you who want to watch both and get a little bit more insight. But yeah, guys, 9.05 is a very exciting patch for Elemental Shaman. It's going to be very, very strong for us, and I believe that it's going to shift the meta in Mythic Plus. Not for MDI specifically, but for people that view Shaman as a lesser class when being brought as a DPS spec into keys. I think people are going to respect the class a lot more just based off of its damage that it's going to bring out. But more people are going to be playing it, and I'm going to be getting more whispers to do keys, which I'm excited about because I like doing keys. So thank you guys so much for watching the video. I know this was a much requested video. Hopefully it wasn't too long, but like the video if you like it. Subscribe for more Shaman and Shadowlands content in the video in the future. If you guys want to help out the algorithm, like the video, leave a comment down below. If you guys also want to support my content, please consider coming over to my Twitch channel, where I did this video live, but also my Patreon page, which I'll be linking down in the video's description. Thank you so much. Keep calm and Maelstrom on. Bye-bye.